I encourage you to leave your Bibles open there to Mark chapter 13, and that'll be where we spend most of our time this morning for our sermon today, Mark chapter 13. I think I was just entering high school at my home congregation when one Sunday came that we were hosting a missionary. And it was an exciting Sunday for us because we, got to hear a guest speaker, and that's always good, regardless of how great your preacher is, hearing the same voice over and over. And sometimes you just want to hear somebody different for a change. And well, we got to hear the missionary come in, and he was going to give us a report about the great mission work that he had been involved with. We had supported him for many years, and he taught a combined Bible class in the auditorium for all of us to be there together, and then he preached that morning sermon. And while he was still standing up on the stage near the end of the service, one of our elders was giving their closing announcements, kind of similar to how we would end our service. And it was a special day for us because not only were we having our class and our worship, but we were also going to share a meal together so that we could spend some time getting to know this missionary. Keeping in mind that was before days like today, where we do that kind of thing almost every Sunday, having a meal together. So this was really a special occasion. And that Sunday, they announced what the menu was going to be, what we were about to go eat for lunch. And they announced that we were going to be having biscuits and gravy. I was thrilled. I love biscuits and gravy. And so whenever I heard that that's what we were going to be having, I was excited. I couldn't wait for that elder to wrap up the announcement so we could go and eat and enjoy that food. But I couldn't help but notice that the missionary, who was still on the stage, he looked like he was going to throw up whenever they said biscuits and gravy. And I was thinking, what's wrong with this man? You know, biscuits and gravy, that's some of the best food that you can have. I'm not sure who could have a problem with it. Well, come to find out that this missionary was originally from England. And so whenever he hears biscuit, he thinks of this. And so whenever he heard that we were going to be having biscuits and gravy for lunch, he was less than pleased. Now, I share that because sometimes crossing cultural barriers and boundaries and being able to effectively communicate clearly, it has some difficulties, even for contemporaries, people who are living at the same time. Add to that thousands of years of difference between when people live, and sometimes it can become quite difficult to understand certain things. As we turn our attention this morning to Mark chapter 13, we're going to be trying to do just that. Trying to remove ourselves from our mindset, from our culture, from our environment, and from the time in which we live, and transport ourselves all the way back many, many years ago, nearly 2,000 years ago, into a different setting, a different time, amongst a different culture of people. You know, the thing about cultural differences is that you can study a lot of things, but there are some things that just kind of they go unspoken, they go unsaid in our cultures because it's just things that we understand. But those who are on the outside, they need some help. And Mark chapter 13 is one of those chapters that, as we dive into it, we're going to find that many people have great difficulty in wrapping their minds around the message that Jesus had for His disciples in this chapter. And part of that is because of the time in which we live. And a big part of that is because we forget that these words were spoken to a different people in a different culture in a different setting. And we're going to dive into that this morning and hopefully try to answer some questions that arise out of this text as we continue our study in the Gospel of Mark. But before we do that, I want to get you to think about something, and I'm going to ask you a question that many of you have probably been asked dozens of times. And the question is simply, where were you on September 11th, 2001? Those who were in their early 20s and younger, they were not yet born. Everyone else, you probably remember exactly where you were. You probably remember exactly where you were and what you were doing whenever you first heard the news about those awful attacks on our nation that took place in that day. If you were still in school, perhaps the school closed early. Or maybe mom and dad came and picked you up early because they wanted to be with their family. If you stayed at school throughout the day, without question, the normal day was no longer a normal day. As teachers stopped with their lectures and they put away their curriculum and they turned on the television and they sat with their students and they watch those events unfold. Perhaps your place of business closed early for the day. It seemed as if our nation and our world stopped in that moment. You know, for those who are Oklahoma natives, or have at least lived in the state for 30 years or so, there's another date that probably springs to your mind, April 19th of 1995. If you think about that Murrah building and the bombing and the horrific tragedy that was there, and the countless who lost their lives, and those who were injured in that terrible event. And many of you have been to Oklahoma City, and you've walked around that memorial, and you see the beauty of that memorial, and you remember that day. Or if you were not yet born, you've been told about that day, and you've thought about what that day would have been like. In our country, just this last week, we had another day of remembrance of December 7th, 1941. We could continue going through lists of dates that, by the mere mention of some dates, it brings memories and emotions and sometimes scars to the surface as we hear of certain dates. Because we remember tragedies, we remember pain, we remember things that forever shaped our culture, or forever shaped our state, or our nation, or even our own lives individually. The reason why I wanted you to think for just a moment about those dates is because Mark chapter 13 is Jesus describing in some great detail one of those kind of dates for the Jewish people. He was describing in detail one of those kind of dates that would forever change the religious landscape, and in many ways the world over, from this date moving forward. But the difference is that this event that Jesus is talking to his disciples about was an event that at that time had not yet taken place. You know, as you and I reflect back on those dates that we mentioned earlier, we think about the things that took place and where we were and what we thought and what we felt. But what Jesus is talking about in Mark chapter 13 was for his disciples in looking into the future about one of these kind of dates that had not yet happened, but it was yet to come in their future, some 30 to 40 years after these sayings of Jesus. And that event, many of you are aware, is the destruction of Jerusalem that took place around AD 70. And we're going to talk about this as we go on, but I want you to understand this at the beginning, that the destruction of Jerusalem was not a small battle where a few buildings were destroyed and maybe a couple hundred people died. We're going to talk more about that in a moment, but this was an event that shaped much of the world. And taking the time to understand this part of history will help us to appreciate and understand these texts better. And I want us to understand that as we begin looking at Mark 13, we won't have time to look at all of it, but we're going to take a pretty good survey this morning, that what we're studying was this event in particular. And it'll help us to understand that text in that culture, in that time for those people, but as well as leave us with some principles that I believe are still applicable for us today. And so that's our mission, that's our objective today. And we're going to begin by looking right here at the beginning of this chapter, Mark 13, starting in verse 1, where we read these words. And as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." You know, in this day and time, Jerusalem, as well as the temple itself, would have been amongst the most beautiful of cities, most beautiful buildings to go to. They would have been the kind of structures that would make you stop and just be in awe of their beauty and their architecture, and wondering how they came about building such a facility, and being in awe of the materials and the wealth that was involved in the construction of these buildings. I want you to think for just a minute about how marvelous it had to have been for the disciples to do what they just did. See, if you were with us last week, we looked at a couple chapters previous in Mark chapter 11, where we find that Jesus was not pleased with how things were happening and how things were taking place within the temple. And so he goes into the temple and he pronounces his condemnation of the temple, and he flips over the tables of the money changers in that dramatic scene that many are familiar with. And the disciples know one thing to be clear as Jesus is leaving from that moment is that Jesus is not happy with what is taking place in Jerusalem. He's not happy with what is taking place in the temple. And here he is drawing all of this attention upon himself. And now here Mark picks up that as they're leaving the temple, the disciples come up to Jesus and say, look at these beautiful buildings. You know, almost as if, all right, he's in a bad mood, and we need to kind of cheer him up. Jesus, look at the beauty that you're surrounded by. And Jesus looks at those stones and those buildings, and he says, yeah, it's all coming down. You know, you can travel today, and you can look at some landmarks, some parts of this destruction that is still there for you to go and to explore and to see today, such as the stone remains from the western wall of the temple that were toppled down and many believe thrown down from higher elevations in an attempt to ward off the sieging Romans who were coming to take the city, and that attempt failed. What we know today to be a historical fact about the destruction of this city and the destruction of this temple, to the disciples as Jesus spoke the words that he spoke, it may as well have just been far-fetched fiction. Could you imagine going back 30 years before September 11th and having somebody tell you about the events that were going to take place? How hard would that be for you to wrap your mind around? And yet that's kind of what we have here, is Jesus letting the disciples know about this earth-shattering event that was going to come, something that was so far beyond their comprehension. But yet Jesus spoke these words to such an extent that at least some of his disciples took what he was saying seriously. Seriously enough that they needed to know more. And so that's where we pick up in verse 3. It says, and as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? And so Mark chapter 13 begins with Jesus exiting the temple, leaving this area, and the disciples admiring the temple and saying, Jesus, look how beautiful these buildings are. And Jesus says it's all going to be destroyed. And they come to him and they say, what's going to be the sign? Tell us, what are we going to be looking for? What do we need to be on the lookout for that whenever we see these things, then we know that what you just said was going to take place. We know that that's about to happen. Lord, give us the sign. And the reason why it's so important that we begin right there is because what follows in this chapter is Jesus telling his disciples in that moment, in that culture, in that time, what they themselves needed to be on the lookout for in order to prepare themselves for the destruction of Jerusalem. You have no doubt probably heard some talk about how we today are living in the end of days, the end of times, that the end is almost here. And they'll point to various things, usually linked to a misunderstanding of Mark chapter 13 or Matthew chapter 24 or Luke chapter 21 and these parallel passages of Jesus talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, and they'll apply that to the end of the world, such as this text here in Mark 13 and in verse 8, where it says, for nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of birth pains. You know this as well as I do, that every time that there is a new war, a new conflict, or an earth-shattering earthquake where many lose their lives, somewhere within our society, somebody arises proclaiming, we're in the last days, just as Jesus predicted. The end is almost here. The problem with that is that Jesus was specifically answering a question concerning the destruction of the temple. You see, he was speaking to people, and Mark, in his gospel, was writing to people who had not yet experienced this destruction of Jerusalem. And so as we read this chapter, we need to not read this as signs for us to decode and decipher for the end of the world, as many seem to struggle with today. but rather understanding what Jesus was doing in his condemnation of Jerusalem, in his condemnation of the temple. We pick up in verse 14. It says, "But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." See, Mark, throughout his gospel and here in a couple of places in this text, he often expects a lot out of those who read his writings. He doesn't fill in all the gaps and all the details, but rather he'll leave some parenthetical notes such as, understand what I'm saying. Think deeply about what it is that I'm writing. I wish we had the time this morning to dive into this abomination of desolation. It's from a prophecy in the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 9, and dealing with the desecration of their holy place being defiled. And so as the disciples asked Jesus, what are the signs? What are we supposed to look for to know that these things are about to happen, that Jerusalem's about to be destroyed? One of those signs was this abomination of desolation in their holy place, in their temple. Luke, in his parallel account, would write in Luke 21 and in verse 20, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near." A lot of what we know about this horrible event, we know by way of Josephus, a famous Jewish historian, who would record many things for us, including how the Romans surrounded the city of Jerusalem. But they didn't just surround the city of Jerusalem. You see, they were very strategic in that they waited for the time of the Passover. As we looked at a few weeks ago, as the masses would flock to the city, would come to Jerusalem for the Passover, and the city would swell to many times its normal size, and that would aid the Romans in their strategy. As the city was swelled with all of these visitors, then they surrounded the city and cut off the supply of the city and began to starve the residents to death, not allowing anyone to come, allowing a lot of infighting to take place, people fighting and killing over morsels of food before the Romans ever began to attack. In fact, when all was said and done, 97,000 Jews were enslaved and 1.7 million Jews died. I want you to sit with those numbers for a moment, because the thousands of lives that have been lost during our nation's greatest tragedies leaves a mark. What would this loss do to a people? 97,000 slaves, 1.7 million who had died. Interestingly enough, secular history doesn't record for us any Christians dying during this siege. It's not to say that there were none, but rather we don't know about them if that did happen. But rather they fled to the land of Pella, which was in the Transjordan Valley around AD 66, as they began to see the signs of what Jesus had proclaimed was going to take place. And this is part of the remains of that city that archaeologists have uncovered, and they found all sorts of evidence of the Christians who had lived during that time. But then we reach verse 24 of this chapter, which is where Gene had begun his reading for us this morning. Starting here in verse 24, it says, "But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heaven." It certainly sounds, especially in a vacuum, as if right here in this text that Jesus is maybe shifting his focus, and now we're talking about end of the world stuff. I mean, isn't that what that sounds like, right? This is some cosmic language dealing with the stars falling and the moon not giving its light and the Son of Man coming, this day of the Lord. And we think that's what this has to be talking about. And that leads to a lot of confusion for many. But what's important, I believe, for us to keep note of is that Jesus, not only being the Son of Man of Scripture, not only being the Son of God, being God himself in the flesh, but here's something else we know about Jesus, is that Jesus knew his Bible really well, the Hebrew Scriptures. And what we find is that what Jesus is doing is he is simply borrowing from the same judgment language that was filled throughout his Bible. Whenever God would bring destruction upon cities that were not who God wanted them to be. Just one example that we'll look at is Isaiah chapter 13, beginning here in verse 9, where it says, "Behold, the day of the Lord comes cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation and to destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light." You see the similarities here. You see, this is Isaiah's prophecy out against Babylon. This was how God pronounced his judgment against Babylon, that he was going to bring that city to a ruin. And here, what we find is, in response to the disciples' question about Jerusalem being destroyed, what are the signs? What do we need to be looking for? And Jesus gives them those signs, and then he borrows from Isaiah's language that was for the destruction of Babylon as he begins to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, I want us to pause and sit with this for a minute, because to me, this is one of the most striking and sobering thoughts in the entire chapter, is that the same message that God had for Babylon, he was now using those same words of condemnation towards those that were supposed to be his people. That those that were so contrary to him, they were his enemies, and God pronounces his judgment on them. And now we find God using that same language for the people of Jerusalem. Why? That they were a people who were called by his name. They were that beautiful city that was set up on the hill. They had these marvelous temples. Why would God use that same language of destruction for Babylon to apply to them who were supposed to be his people? And the answer to that was simply they did not honor Jesus as their king. That they rejected the Messiah. We don't have the time to walk through these things, but as you have your Bible open there and you look at verse 28 through 31, we find that Jesus will then give them a lesson from the fig tree, verse 28 through 31. Remember, the disciples' question at the start of this chapter was, what are the signs for when all of these things are about to take place? Give us warning. Let us know before this happens. And so Jesus says, just like a fig tree will put out its leaves, and that lets you know that summer is almost here. When you see these things coming, all of these signs that I've said, the holy place being desecrated, whenever you see those signs of the armies that begin to gather around, you know it's almost time. And he tells them to run for the hills, a message that would make no sense if we're talking about the end of the world and global destruction. We're talking about a specific people and a specific time. But then Jesus would go on and say, but concerning that day and hour, no one knows, that they needed to be watchful. You know, because of these warnings of Jesus that we find here in Mark 13, and the disciples listening to and spreading those warnings of Jesus, they were spared in the land of Pella. Even in that great tragedy, we don't know of a single disciple of Jesus that lost their lives. We look at that chapter from a bird's eye view this morning for this reason. I want us to understand that Mark 13 is not a chapter to be taken for us to decipher as some kind of a code to predict the end of time. Jesus was talking about something specific that's already come and gone that we can study and learn from today. However, I do think that there are some prevailing principles for us to think about just real briefly this morning. And the first one is this, that destruction comes to those who do not honor Christ as their king. You've got this people, the holy chosen race of God, the city set on a hill. They have their beautiful temple. They have their scribes and their Pharisees. They have their schools. They have their wealth. They have their land, all provisions and blessings from God. But yet, when they did not honor Jesus as their king, they stepped out of being God's people to being God's enemies. And so as we think about what do we take away from this, a real question for each one of us is Jesus my king? Do I honor him as my Lord? And that goes so much deeper than coming to church on Sunday and singing songs of praise and opening up my Bible a couple days a week. Is he my master? Because that was the difference. That's what took God's people from being His people to being His enemies, was not honoring Jesus as their king. And the second thing I want us to think about for a moment is that the Bible is filled with judgments from God. All the way back in Genesis chapter 6, it doesn't take very long for a judgment to be pronounced, where we have the flood. And God goes and He frees His people after that from Egypt, and He establishes them as their own nation, their own people, and then God brings judgment on them, His own people, because they quit following Him and honoring Him the way that they should. They go off into Babylon, and then we read of that language and that condemnation against Babylon. God brought justice to them, and God's people, they're reestablished. They've rebuilt the temple, and He brings judgment upon them again. Why? Because they quit following Him. So what do we take from this ancient story that it isn't us looking into our future, just studying their history, but what do we do with that? Well, the question that I want us to think about this morning as we close is, when our judgment comes, which we don't have signs for, we won't have the ability to know that it's getting close, and we won't have warning of a time for us to get ready. Are we ready? Because that judgment is coming. And a great way for you to be able to answer that question in your mind, am I ready for that judgment, is how I answer this question. Is Jesus my King? Is He my Lord? Does He have my life? Does He have my obedience? If He does, you're ready. If He doesn't, you're not. If you're here this morning and we can help you become ready for that judgment that will come at some point, we have no signs, we have no seasons to look for, but we know it's coming. We'd love to help you prepare for that day. If we can help you do that this morning, we invite you to come as together we stand and sing the song of invitation.